She was 20 years old, and in the space of a morning had been made homeless. Her sisters had left her with no family, no money, and no plan, just the small wooden bird in her pocket and the clothes she stood in. She stood in the empty bedroom of the house in Gresbury, a house that was no longer hers, and looked at the swept floorboards where her life had been. But what her sisters, in their haste and their greed, did not know was that a mother's love can hide in the smallest of places, waiting for the child who needs it most. This is the story of that love, and the life it built from nothing. Settle in, and let us know in the comments where you are watching from today. Martha Cole had grown up in the shadow of her two elder sisters, Lavinia and Beatrice. They were sharp, handsome girls who took after their father, a solicitor whose affections were measured out like deeds and titles, granted only upon evidence of worth. He saw that worth in Lavinia's cutting wit and Beatrice's shrewd grasp of household accounts. He saw very little of it in Martha, who was quiet and watchful, and who most resembled their mother, a woman who had moved through the house like a gentle mist, present but rarely noticed until she was gone. Their mother, Eleanor, had died of a lung fever when Martha was 12, and with her went the only source of uncomplicated warmth in the house. Mrs. Cole had loved the garden, the smell of baking bread, and the quiet hours after supper when she would sit with Martha, teaching her the intricate stitches of embroidery or the names of herbs she grew in a small, sheltered patch behind the kitchens. She taught Martha that value was not always loud, that strength could be found in patience, and that a home was made of small, repeated acts of care. It was her mother who had carved the small wooden bird, a smooth, featureless wren that fit perfectly in the palm of a hand, whittling it one afternoon from a piece of fallen applewood. "For your pocket," she had said, "so you always have a friend." After her death, Mr. Cole's indifference to his youngest daughter hardened into a kind of permanent dismissal. He provided for her education, such as it was, with a governess who taught her reading, sums, and geography. But it was Mrs. Gable, the cook, who became her true mentor. Mrs. Gable was a widow from the north, a woman of formidable competence and few words. She saw in Martha a reflection of her own practical nature, and took it upon herself to teach the girl what she considered essential knowledge. From Mrs. Gable, Martha learned how to render fat, make a clear stock, preserve fruit, and bake a dozen different kinds of bread and cakes. She learned how to mix lime wash, how to darn a stocking so the mend was nearly invisible, and how to manage a larder so that nothing was ever wasted. "Pay attention to the bones of a thing," Mrs. Gable would say, whether speaking of a chicken carcass or a leaking roof. "The structure is what matters. Finery is just weather." While Lavinia and Beatrice learned French and watercolors, Martha learned the quiet, sturdy crafts of keeping a house alive. Her sisters mocked her for it, calling her the scullery maid, but Martha found a deep satisfaction in the work, in the tangible results of her labor. She knew how to make things whole again, and it was a comfort. The ejection, when it came, was as quiet and brutal as a winter frost. Their father died suddenly of a heart seizure in his office, leaving his affairs in perfect, unyielding order. A week after the funeral, the three sisters sat in the very same office, the air still smelling faintly of his bay rum and leather-bound books, while Mr. Davies, his junior partner, read the will. It was a short, precise document. The house in Gresbury, its contents, and the entirety of his financial estate were left in equal shares to his beloved daughters, Lavinia and Beatrice Cole. To his youngest daughter, Martha, he left the sum of £10, for her maintenance until such time as she can secure a suitable position. A silence fell in the room, thick and heavy. Mr. Davies cleared his throat, refusing to meet Martha's eyes. Lavinia smoothed the black silk of her skirt, a faint, triumphant smile playing on her lips. "Well?" Beatrice said, her voice crisp and businesslike. "That is all quite clear." They signed the necessary papers. Martha's hand did not tremble as she wrote her name, acknowledging receipt of a legacy her sisters immediately declared would be absorbed by the funeral expenses. "It is only fair, Martha," Lavinia said, her tone suggesting it was anything but. "We are handling everything, after all." That evening, they informed her that the house had been sold to a physician from Salisbury. The new owner wished to take possession as soon as possible. They had arranged for carters to come the next morning to pack and remove all the furniture and effects, which were to be sold at auction. She would have to find other accommodation. A room somewhere, perhaps, Beatrice suggested vaguely, as if speaking of a distant acquaintance. "With your skills, you could find a place as a housekeeper. We could even provide a reference." The offer was a final, dismissive cruelty. Martha did not argue. She did not plead or weep. She simply nodded, turned, and went up to her room. She packed her few belongings into a small canvas satchel. 2 spare dresses, her mending kit, Mrs. Gable's book of recipes, and the worn copy of herbal remedies her mother had treasured. She spent the night in a chair, listening to the sounds of her sisters moving through the house, their voices sharp and decisive as they tagged items for the auctioneer. The next morning, they were gone before she woke. She came downstairs to find a house hollowed out, stripped of its life. Every painting, every rug, every chair and table was gone. Even the curtains had been taken down. In the kitchen, the shelves were bare. All that remained was dust and silence. She walked out the back door to retrieve her satchel from the small shed where she had hidden it, and when she returned, the front door was locked. A key turned, a bolt slid home. She was outside, and her life was inside. Or rather, it was gone. She stood on the step for a long moment, then turned and walked back around the house, to the one window she knew was never properly latched, the window to her own bedroom. She climbed the trellis where a climbing rose had grown for 50 years, its thorns catching at her skirts. The window slid open with a familiar groan. She slipped inside, back into the empty room. It was here in this hollow space that the past came to her not as a ghost, but as a memory of a sound. A creak. There was a loose floorboard beside the window, the one her mother's rocking chair had always found. Her mother had a habit of hiding small things: a shilling for the church poor box, a packet of seeds, a special button, in odd places, tucked away from the orderly, scrutinizing gaze of her husband. Martha knelt, the rough wool of her dress scratching against the bare wood. She pressed on the edge of the board with her thumb. It gave slightly. Using the tip of her button hook from her satchel, she worked it into the crack and gently pried. The board lifted with a small sigh of old wood. Beneath it, nestled in the dusty space between the joists, was a small tin box, the kind that once held expensive tea. It was wrapped in a piece of oilcloth. Her hands trembled now as she lifted it out. Inside, the box was heavy. She lifted the lid. It was filled, astonishingly, with gold sovereigns stacked in neat columns. Beneath them lay a small, folded piece of paper and a tiny, embroidered needlebook. She unfolded the paper. The handwriting was her mother's, elegant and careful. "My dearest Martha," it began, "if you are reading this, then I am gone and you are in need. I could not give this to you while I lived, for your father would not have understood. He does not see your worth, but I do. You have a quiet strength, my love, and a good heart. This is what I saved, a little at a time, from the household accounts over many years. It is not a fortune, but I pray it is enough to give you a start. Be wise with it. Find a small place of your own, a place with a garden if you can. Trust in what you know how to do. You are more capable than anyone has ever allowed you to be. Your loving mother, Eleanor. Martha read the letter twice, her vision blurring. She counted the coins. There were 50 gold sovereigns, 50 pounds, a sum beyond her imagining. It was a lifeline, a secret act of love left buried for years. She tucked the letter and the needlebook into her dress, poured the coins into a linen pouch, and replaced the empty box and the floorboard. She had what she needed. She slipped back out the window, not looking back at the empty house, and began to walk. She walked away from Gresbury, her satchel on her back, and her mother's love a solid, comforting weight in her pocket. The road stretched out before her, a ribbon of pale dirt winding through the green Wiltshire downs. The sky was a high, thin gray, and a cool wind promised rain, but Martha felt a strange, fierce calm. She was alone, but she was not destitute. She had been given a chance. She walked for 2 hours until the spire of the Gresbury church was just a needlepoint against the horizon, and then she kept walking towards the market town of Axford, a place where no one knew her name. In Axford, she took a modest room for 2 nights at a clean, respectable inn, paying the landlady with a shilling and explaining she was seeking a position. The town was larger than Gresbury, a bustling place of weavers, merchants, and farmers. On her first morning, while walking through the market square, she saw a notice posted in the window of a solicitor's office. The paper yellowed and curled at the edges. It advertised the sale of a property on the outskirts of the village. The weaver's cottage, sold as seen to settle the estate of the late Mr. Abel Croft, in need of considerable repair. She inquired within. The solicitor, a dry, dusty man named Mr. Poole, seemed surprised anyone was asking. He explained the cottage had been empty for nearly a decade, ever since old Croft, a weaver of some local renown, had passed on with no heirs. It had fallen into disrepair. The price was £8 for the freehold and the small parcel of land it stood on. "It's the land that has any value, miss," he said, peering at her over his spectacles. "The cottage itself is likely fit only for pulling down." Martha asked for the key and the location. It was a half-mile walk from the town center, down a lane that dwindled into a muddy track. The cottage stood alone, nestled against a small copse of ash trees. Mr. Poole had not exaggerated. The roof sagged in the middle like a tired old horse, and several slates were missing. The windows were boarded up, and the front door hung crookedly on one hinge. The garden was a riot of nettles and brambles, so thick she could barely make out the stone wall that enclosed it. But the walls of the cottage were built of good, solid Cotswold stone, gray and streaked with moss, and the chimney stack stood tall and straight. She saw what Mrs. Gable had taught her to see, the bones of the thing. She borrowed a crowbar from a nearby farmer and pried the boards from a window. The air that met her from inside was thick with the smell of damp, decay, and mouse droppings. Sunlight struggled through the grime-caked panes, illuminating a single large room. At one end was a great stone hearth, black with soot. At the other, shrouded in cobwebs, stood the ruin of a large timber-frame loom, its heddles broken, its warp threads long since rotted away. A steep, narrow staircase led to a low-beamed loft. The floor was stone flags, slick with damp, and the plaster on the walls was crumbling away from the lath. It was a wreck. It was perfect. She returned to Mr. Poole's office, counted out 8 gold sovereigns onto his desk, and signed the deed of sale. The cottage was hers. The first week was spent simply making the place habitable. Martha worked from dawn until dusk, her body aching with a fatigue so profound it felt like a kind of peace. She started by clearing the garden, a brutal, relentless task. With a borrowed scythe and a billhook, she attacked the brambles and nettles, her hands protected by thick leather gloves she bought at the market. Beneath the thorny jungle, she found the ghosts of a proper garden. The raised beds, their stone borders tumbled and askew, a gnarled apple tree choked with ivy, and a profusion of herbs that had run wild, mint, lemon balm, and a tough, woody rosemary. She found the well, its stone cap heavy but intact, and after hours of hauling up buckets of stagnant water, she was rewarded with a flow that was cold, clear, and sweet. Inside the cottage, she swept away years of accumulated dirt and debris. She scrubbed the stone flags with lye and sand until they showed their true gray and ochre colors. She tore out the ruined, mildewed plaster, exposing the sturdy oak lath beneath. The great hearth was her biggest challenge. It was choked with soot and fallen nests. While clearing the packed earth and debris from the back of the fireplace, her shovel struck something hard that was not stone. Curious, she dug around it with her hands, pulling away the dirt and hardened soot. It was a small, iron-strapped wooden box, wedged deep into a cavity behind a loose fire brick. It was not locked. She lifted the heavy lid, her heart beating a steady, curious rhythm. This was a different feeling from finding her mother's tin. That had been a desperate prayer answered. This was a quiet discovery, a secret belonging to the house itself. Inside, resting on a bed of dried lavender, were a set of weaver's tools, 3 polished boxwood shuttles, a handful of bobbins, a reed hook, and a pair of fine steel shears, all oiled and wrapped in waxed cloth, perfectly preserved. Beneath them was a small, leather-bound ledger and a folded note. The note was written in a spidery, elegant hand. "To whoever finds this," it read. "My name is Abel Croft. I was a weaver in this cottage for 52 years. My wife, Sarah, died in 48 and we had no children. These were her shears. I leave them here, with my best shuttles, in the hope that someone might come to work this loom again. A craft should not die with a man. The ledger contains my patterns. May they serve you well." Martha opened the ledger. The pages were filled with intricate drawings of weaving drafts, herringbone, bird's eye, damask, and on the last page, a simple note. Sarah loved the columbine pattern best. Here was a second secret, a second inheritance. Not of money, but of purpose. A legacy of craft, left by a stranger, waiting in the dark at the heart of the house. She had bought a ruin, but she had been given a history. The rebuilding began in earnest. Martha knew her limits. She could patch plaster, but she could not mend a roof. She sought out Mr. Finch, a slater and stonemason in the village, an elderly man with hands as gnarled as oak roots. He came and looked at the roof, squinting at the sky. "Needs half new slate, half new lath," he grunted. "Cost you £5 for the materials, 2 more for my labor." It was a significant portion of her remaining capital, but it was essential. She agreed. For a week she worked as his laborer, climbing the ladder to hand him slates and bundles of lath, fetching him water, and listening as he explained the art of laying the slates in proper courses, each one overlapping the last just so. "Like feathers on a bird," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Keeps the water out." He showed her how to mix lime mortar for repointing the chimney stack, the proper ratio of lime putty, sand, and water. He was a man of few words, but his instruction was precise. He respected her willingness to work, and by the end of the week, when the roof was sound and the chimney secure, he knocked a pound off his bill. "For a good apprentice," was all he said. With the cottage dry, she turned to the interior. She bought lath and bags of lime from a builder's merchant and taught herself the slow, rhythmic work of plastering. She mixed the plaster in a wooden tub, the lime and sand and horsehair, adding water until it was the consistency of thick porridge, a recipe she recalled from Mrs. Gable's pronouncements on household repairs. The trowel felt awkward in her hand at first, but she learned the feel of it, the way to press and smooth the plaster against the lath in a firm, even coat. Room by room, the damp, crumbling walls were transformed into clean, white surfaces that smelled of earth and rain. She glazed the windows herself, buying panes of glass and putty in the town. She remembered watching a glazier repair a window in the Gresbury house years ago, and she mimicked his patient movements, pressing the triangular points into the wood frame and smoothing the putty with a steady knife. The community, at first watchful and distant, began to draw closer, not with words, but with small, practical offerings. Mrs. Davies, the baker's wife, appeared one afternoon with a loaf of bread still warm from the oven and a small pot of broth. "You can't live on air and hard work," she said, her expression kind but unsentimental. A young boy named Tom, whose father was the farmer who had lent her the crowbar, began to appear each morning to help her fetch water from the well, accepting a penny and a baked apple for his trouble. He told her stories of old Mr. Croft, the weaver, who had always had a pocket full of mints for the village children. Through these small connections, Martha began to feel the threads of community weaving themselves around her. The cottage slowly became a home. The plaster dried, and she gave the walls a final coat of whitewash, which made the small space feel bright and airy. She repaired the crooked door, sanding it down and rehanging it with new iron hinges. She built simple furniture from salvaged wood, a sturdy table, a bench, 2 stools, and a bed frame in the loft, which she filled with a mattress stuffed with straw and dried lavender. The great loom remained a silent sentinel in the corner of the room. It was too complex for her to repair yet, but she cleaned it carefully, oiling the wooden frame and polishing the remaining metal parts, feeling a sense of custodianship for Abel Croft's legacy. Her garden, once cleared, proved to be her greatest resource. The soil was rich and dark. She discovered that the weeds choking the beds were in fact a treasure trove of medicinal and culinary herbs. Feverfew, yarrow, comfrey, thyme, and a half-dozen varieties of mint. She remembered her mother's lessons and Mrs. Gable's recipes, and she began to cultivate them. She planted rows of vegetables, carrots, onions, cabbages, and beans, and the gnarled apple tree, once freed from the ivy, produced a small but sweet crop of fruit. As autumn deepened, she began to take her small surplus to the weekly market in Axford. She set up a humble stall with a clean linen cloth, offering bunches of dried herbs, small bottles of comfrey salve, pots of mint jelly, and simple oatcakes baked on the hearth. At first, people were hesitant, but Mrs. Davies made a point of buying a jar of jelly and declaring it the best she'd ever tasted. Slowly, others began to buy from her. They knew her now, not as the strange girl who had bought the Croft ruin, but as Martha Cole, the woman who had brought it back to life. They knew her by the quality of her work. Her salves were effective, her herbs were fragrant, her oatcakes were wholesome. She became a small, steady part of the village's life. She established her own quiet rituals, rising with the sun, tending her garden, working on the cottage, and in the evenings, sitting by the fire with a cup of mint tea, reading from her mother's herbal or studying the weaver's intricate patterns in his ledger. She was not lonely. The cottage was filled with the quiet company of those who had come before her mother's love, Abel Croft's dedication, Mrs. Gable's practical wisdom. Her life was small, but it was entirely her own, built from the ground up with her own two hands. An evening in late October found her sitting by the hearth. A fire of applewood logs crackled and hissed, filling the small room with warmth and the scent of wood smoke. The stone walls, once damp and crumbling, were now a warm, solid embrace. The window panes she had set herself reflected the flickering firelight, holding the darkness at bay. On the newly built mantelpiece, made from a single piece of weathered oak she had found in the woods, sat two objects. One was the small, smooth wooden wren her mother had carved for her all those years ago. It had been her only companion on the road from Gresbury. Next to it sat one of Abel Croft's boxwood shuttles, the one shaped like a sleek little boat, polished by a lifetime of use until it shone like silk. She held her mother's letter in her hands, the paper soft and creased from being read so many times. "You have a quiet strength, my love. Trust in what you know how to do." Her mother had seen her, truly seen her, in a way her father and sisters never had. They had seen a plain, quiet girl, useful only for menial tasks. They had seen someone to be dismissed and discarded. Her mother had seen a survivor. She thought of Lavinia and Beatrice, imagining them in a fine London house, surrounded by the auctioned remnants of their father's life. She felt no anger, no bitterness, only a distant, quiet pity. They had taken everything they considered to be of value, the silver, the mahogany, the china, and had left the true treasure behind, hidden under a floorboard. They had mistaken a house for a home. They had traded love for currency. Martha looked around the room she had built. Every surface, every object, held a story of her own labor. The smooth plaster on the walls, the sturdy table, the clean-swept hearth. Her gaze fell upon the great loom in the corner. She had begun to repair it, restringing the heddles with new cord, carefully following the diagrams in Abel Croft's ledger. Soon, she would try to warp it, to weave a simple piece of cloth. She would start with the columbine pattern, the one Sarah had loved best. It was a way of honoring the gift he had left her, a way of keeping a promise to a man she had never met. The cottage was more than a shelter. It was a testament. It was proof that what is abandoned can be reclaimed, that what is broken can be mended, and that a life can be built not on what you are given, but on what you are capable of creating. Martha Cole was 20 years old and had been cast out with nothing. She had spent 8 pounds of her mother's secret love on a ruined cottage. It was the best 8 pounds she had ever spent. The story of Martha Cole reminds us that the greatest inheritances are not always the ones written into wills. They are the hidden legacies of love, skill, and quiet courage passed down to us. They are the strengths we discover in ourselves when we are left with nothing but our own two hands. What hidden strengths have you discovered in your own life during a time of trial? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below, and if this story resonated with you, please consider sharing it with someone who might need to hear it. Thank you for being with us today.